What happens when a therapist becomes the one being analyzed? Every week, millions tune in to hear a calm voice from a small studio in Seattle. A voice that listens. A voice that explains. A voice that heals. The podcast is called Psychology in Seattle. But this is not just any psychology podcast. Behind the microphone sits Dr. Kirk Honda, a licensed therapist with decades of experience, a professor, a cultural commentator, and perhaps a man hiding more than he reveals. For years, listeners have trusted him to dissect the minds of others: troubled couples, narcissists, toxic parents, even fictional characters from Netflix dramas. But here's the question no one dares to ask. What lies inside his mind? What shaped this man's obsession with human behavior? What personal trauma pushed him toward the couch, and then behind it? Because if you listen closely, not just to his words, but to the pauses, the sighs, the slips, you might hear a different story. A story not of patience, but of the psychologist himself. And that's what we're going to explore today. This is the untold journey of psychology in Seattle. Before he was a voice in our headphones, before he was a therapist unraveling the twisted minds of pop culture icons, Kirk Honda was just a quiet boy growing up in the rainy suburbs of Seattle. Half Japanese, half white, a child caught between cultures, expectations, and identities. Raised in a society that often whispered instead of talking, and ignored instead of confronting. In interviews and podcast segments, he's briefly mentioned his father, a stoic man, traditional, perhaps emotionally distant. His mother, warm but overwhelmed. Kirk often described himself as a sensitive child, deeply affected by others' emotions, even when they weren't expressed aloud. He didn't just listen. He absorbed. That sensitivity, that deep emotional radar, became both his burden and his superpower. In high school, he wasn't the loudest or the most popular, but he was the one people trusted with their secrets. Friends would confide in him, cry in front of him, and he'd listen for hours without judgment. Was this empathy or an early form of self-protection? You see, sometimes when a child grows up in emotional chaos, they learn to become emotional caretakers, tuning into every shift in mood like their survival depends on it. Maybe that's why Kirk chose psychology. Maybe he wasn't just trying to understand others. He was trying to understand himself. After college, he pursued a master's degree in marriage and family therapy. Then came the years of clinical practice, session after session, listening to the darkest parts of human nature: betrayal, loss, abuse, shame. And still, he kept going. Most therapists burn out. Some become cynical. But Kirk went deeper. He became a professor, then a supervisor, then a public voice. But what's more intriguing is how he began sharing. In 2008, he launched a humble little podcast with a simple idea: make psychology accessible. No academic jargon. No ivory tower gatekeeping. Just real talk. Real emotions. Real healing. It was called Psychology in Seattle. And it started small. A few dozen listeners. Some curious students. A couple of colleagues. But something about his voice, calm, measured, comforting, kept people coming back. And over time, that voice reached millions. But here's where it gets interesting. Because as his reach grew, so did the weight of his words. He wasn't just a therapist anymore. He was now a public therapist, analyzing relationships on reality shows, breaking down celebrity trauma, discussing mental illness in a way the internet hadn't seen before. And yet, through it all, he rarely talked deeply about himself. At least, not directly. The few times he did, a brief story about his childhood, a quiet reflection about vulnerability, a moment where his voice cracked, fans leaned in. Because beneath the clinical training and calm demeanor, there was something more. Something personal. Something he wasn't fully ready to share. Not yet. We explore the birth of psychology in Seattle. But more importantly, we ask, what was the moment that changed everything? It started with a microphone. A dusty one. Plugged into a basic recorder, sitting on a desk in a quiet Seattle apartment. No studio. No production team. Just Dr. Kirk Honda, a few close friends, and a question. Why don't more people understand therapy? In 2008, podcasts were still a fringe thing. Mostly tech, politics, comedy. Psychology? That was locked in classrooms and therapist offices. Kirk wanted to change that. And so, Psychology in Seattle was born. The first episodes were raw, rough audio, casual conversations. They didn't pretend to be experts. They weren't trying to impress academia. They just talked. About trauma. About love. About why people do the things they do. Slowly, an audience began to gather. Not in a viral way. Not overnight. But gradually. Students started listening. Therapists shared it with their clients. Strangers emailed him saying, "This helped me understand my mother. This helped me understand myself." And something shifted. For the first time in years, people were engaging with psychology, not as cold science, but as human survival. But what really set the podcast apart wasn't just the content. It was Kirk's voice. Empathetic. Curious. Never rushed. The kind of voice that made you feel like you were being seen, even through headphones. And then came the turning point. Reality television was dominating culture. Shows like 90 Day Fiancé were exploding online. But while most people mocked the contestants, laughed at their dysfunction, or called them crazy, Dr. Honda did something radical. He analyzed them. With compassion. He broke down attachment styles, personality disorders, codependent dynamics, all through the lens of entertainment. Suddenly, his voice was no longer niche. It was viral. Tens of thousands of new listeners poured in. YouTubers clipped his insights. Reddit threads quoted him. People who had never set foot in therapy started using terms like avoidant attachment and emotional regulation. The podcast grew exponentially. But so did the pressure. Because when you start analyzing people in the public eye, celebrities, influencers, reality stars, not everyone agrees with your interpretation. Some called him irresponsible. Some accused him of diagnosing without consent. Some fans started obsessing, not over the shows, but over him. One comment read, "Dr. Honda is too soft on narcissists. He clearly has narcissistic traits himself." Another, "Why does he keep bringing up his childhood? Is this even about the client anymore?" The very thing that made his podcast powerful, his humanity, was now under a microscope. And yet, he didn't stop. Instead, he leaned in. He began revealing more of himself. Moments from his past. His own therapy sessions. The pain of being misunderstood, even as a professional. Because maybe that was the real mission of Psychology in Seattle all along. Not just to explain others, but to show that even therapists are human. What began as a simple podcast had become something deeper. A mirror. For the listener, and for the man behind the mic. But the bigger the mirror, the darker the shadows. We confront those shadows. When does understanding cross the line into obsession? Psychology is a tool. A powerful one. But like any tool, in the wrong hands or without caution, it can cut both ways. Dr. Kirk Honda's podcast was meant to educate, to illuminate, to offer empathy where judgment once lived. But something strange began to happen as the show grew in popularity. People weren't just listening to episodes anymore. They were dissecting them. In Reddit threads, Discord groups, YouTube comments, listeners began analyzing Dr. Honda himself. Every word, every pause, every time his voice cracked. Was he projecting? Was he too soft on certain personalities? Was the therapist revealing more than he realized? Take, for example, the 90 Day Fiancé episodes. When Dr. Honda analyzed cast members like Colt, Debbie, or Big Ed, fans applauded his compassion. But when he discussed someone with possible narcissistic traits and refrained from flat-out condemning them, some listeners lashed out. Why is he defending abusers? Is he afraid to call out narcissists because he sees himself in them? These weren't just comments. These were psychoanalyses. Of the analyst. In one revealing moment, Dr. Honda once admitted on air, "I sometimes worry that people will find out I'm just as messed up as everyone else." That sentence struck a chord. Because in the eyes of many, therapists are supposed to be above the chaos. Collected. unbreakable. But Dr. Honda was doing something dangerous. Something rare. He was showing his flaws. His own vulnerabilities. His fear of judgment. His longing to be understood, not just as a professional, but as a person. And to some listeners, that made him more credible. To others, it blurred the line. Where does teaching end and self-soothing begin? There were moments when fans crossed boundaries. Emails that felt too personal. Parasocial relationships that became obsessive. A few listeners even tried to contact his family. Others speculated about his marriage, his childhood trauma, his therapeutic biases. It was the very phenomenon he often warned about in his episodes. Projection. Transference. Obsession. But now, he was the subject. And the truth is, maybe that was inevitable. Because when someone opens a window into the human soul, sooner or later, people start looking through their windows too. We explore what happens when boundaries collapse. When the line between public therapist and private person disappears, and the healer becomes the haunted. Boundaries are the backbone of therapy. They protect both the client and the therapist. But what happens when those lines blur? Not in a quiet room behind closed doors, but in front of thousands, even millions, of strangers online. This was Dr. Kirk Honda's new reality. The more episodes he released, the more personal he became. He started to talk openly about his own therapy, his childhood shame, his cultural identity struggles, his pain. For many listeners, this was refreshing. It was real. Revolutionary. A therapist who wasn't hiding behind credentials, but peeling back his layers, piece by piece. But there was a risk. Because when you open yourself like that, you invite people in. Not just the curious. Not just the hurt. But the entitled. The obsessed. Listeners began crossing boundaries, not maliciously at first. But gradually. One fan emailed him a 30-page document analyzing his relationship history, based solely on what he'd revealed in passing. Another tried to send gifts to his personal address. A third created a YouTube channel entirely dedicated to interpreting his emotional expressions during podcasts. Suddenly, Kirk wasn't just the therapist anymore. He was the case study. And here's the most chilling part. Dr. Honda knew this would happen. In countless episodes, he warned about parasocial attachment. That feeling when a listener believes they know the person behind the mic. But what if, despite all his training, he underestimated just how strong that attachment could become? Some fans began to expect emotional caretaking from him. Why didn't you respond to my trauma email? Why did you seem sad this week? Are you okay? Tell us. Why didn't you mention me on the episode? The very empathy he had built his platform on was now being used against him. And so, Kirk had to do something painful. He started to pull back. Fewer personal stories. Less vulnerability. He tightened his tone. Reaffirmed his role not as a friend or surrogate father, but as an educator. And yet, the damage had already been done. Because once you let people into your soul, you can't shut the door without leaving someone heartbroken. And some of them don't take it well. We confront the cost of emotional exposure. The toll of being the internet's therapist. And we ask, can someone who listens to everyone ever find peace for themselves? Empathy is heavy. It may sound beautiful, healing even, but it's not light. It sticks to you. Like smoke. Like a whisper that follows you home. And Dr. Kirk Honda? He wasn't just carrying his emotions. He was carrying ours. With every episode, he opened the door to stories soaked in pain. Abuse. Abandonment. Rage. Loneliness. Listeners poured in their trauma. Not always as clients. Not even as fans. But as broken people, searching for something that maybe their own therapists never gave them. To be heard without judgment. But who listens to the listener? Who helps the man whose job is to help everyone else? Kirk once admitted quietly in a forgotten episode. Sometimes after I record, I don't feel okay. I don't know if people understand what it does to you to hold space for so much pain. That wasn't weakness. That was truth. Because the work he did, free therapy for strangers, public processing of human suffering, it didn't come without a price. sleepless nights, the constant feeling of being observed, the mental balancing act of being professional while being real, and the fear that one wrong word, one misunderstood joke, one misdiagnosis could unravel everything. In an age of cancel culture and online mobs, where context is optional and outrage is currency, Dr. Honda walked a razor's edge. Every emotional take, every boundary pushed, every comment about a reality TV star, it was dissected. Some people said he was brave. Others said he was reckless. That he was using empathy as a shield. That he was crossing ethical lines by analyzing people without their consent. And yet, the numbers kept growing. More downloads, more views, more pain. And so the paradox tightened. The more people he helped, the more isolated he became. But even in that isolation, something else emerged. Something quiet and profound. Connection. Not just the superficial kind. Not likes, views, or followers. But moments where someone would write, "You saved my life. Your voice helped me survive my divorce. I finally understand why my father was the way he was." And maybe that's the truth behind the weight of empathy. It breaks you. It heals others. But sometimes, just sometimes, it heals you too. We explore what happens when a podcast stops being just a podcast and becomes a movement. Psychology in Seattle was no longer about therapy. It had become something else, something bigger, and something more dangerous. At first, Psychology in Seattle was just a podcast, a simple project, a therapist, a microphone, a message. But slowly, almost invisibly, it became more. What started as weekly therapy discussions turned into full-blown commentary on culture, media, relationships, even justice. Dr. Honda wasn't just analyzing reality stars anymore. He was dissecting our world. And for many, especially those disillusioned with traditional mental health systems, this podcast felt like a lifeline. No forms to fill. No diagnosis codes. No awkward 50-minute sessions. Just truth. Unfiltered. Compassionate. Human. Fans started describing the podcast in spiritual terms. It's my church. He's not just a therapist. He's a guide. This show changed the way I see the world. But this adoration came with a price. Because the higher you rise, the more dangerous the fall. Questions began to surface. Was it ethical to analyze real people on a public platform, even if they were celebrities? Was it responsible to process trauma on air without real-time support for listeners triggered by the content? Was Dr. Honda's empathy becoming a brand instead of a boundary? Then came the echo chambers. Reddit threads. Fan forums. Comment wars. Some treated his word like gospel. Others dissected every episode with suspicion. Is he biased against women? Why does he always defend avoidance? Does he secretly hate narcissists? The irony? His entire message had been about critical thinking, about avoiding black and white judgments. But the internet doesn't always play fair. And before long, Dr. Honda found himself caught in the same psychological patterns he tried to warn others about. Hero worship, idealization, devaluation, cancellation. He was no longer just a therapist. He was a symbol, a mirror. People projected onto him what they needed: a father, a healer, a savior. And when he disappointed them, they turned. Not because he was evil, but because he was human. When a movement grows out of pain, it must be handled with care. But the digital world is not a careful place. And in trying to hold everyone's pain, Kirk Honda may have risked losing his own identity. Now we will uncover the turning point. The moment when Psychology in Seattle faced a crisis. And the therapist behind it had to decide: stay silent or finally draw a boundary no one expected. Every story of empathy has a limit. Every healer, a breaking point. And for Dr. Kirk Honda, it came not with a scream, but with a silence. One week, the podcast didn't drop. No new episode. No explanation. Just absence. And in that void came speculation. Is he okay? Did something happen? Was it burnout? Did he say something that got him in trouble? The truth? It was all of it. Kirk had reached a moment that every empath fears. Emotional collapse. Years of holding space for others. Of analyzing suffering, trauma, betrayal, rage. It had seeped into him. Slowly. Silently. Until one day he admitted, in a rare, personal audio diary later uploaded, "I don't know where I end and the pain begins. I don't know where I end and the pain begins." His boundaries had shattered. And the audience, once comforted by his vulnerability, now became part of the pressure. They wanted him back. Needed him. But Kirk knew, if he didn't step back now, there might not be a version of himself left to bring back. So he did something he'd never done before. He drew a hard line. No apologies. No performance. No therapeutic smile. Just truth. In a 12-minute unscheduled update, his voice trembling, he said, "I need to reevaluate the way I've been doing this. Not because I don't care, but because I care so much, it's hurting me." It wasn't just burnout. It was exposure. Emotional exposure. And just like that, the parasocial wall cracked. For the first time, fans realized, Dr. Honda isn't an avatar. Not an all-knowing guide. Not their therapist. He's a man. A human. Vulnerable. Breakable. But even in the silence, even in his retreat, something remarkable happened. Many fans, not all, respected his space. Messages came in, not of entitlement, but of gratitude. "Take all the time you need. Thank you for showing us what healthy boundaries look like. You've already done more than enough." And for the first time in a long time, Dr. Honda wasn't just practicing therapy. He was living it. In real time. Publicly. Courageously. We look at the legacy of psychology in Seattle. What has it taught us about empathy, about boundaries, and about what it really means to heal in a world that's always watching? What does it mean to listen? Not just to hear, but to truly listen. To sit with someone else's pain. To hold their fear without fixing it. To say, "I see you. You matter." In a world full of noise, Dr. Kirk Honda gave us that silence. Not empty silence, but the kind that says, "You're safe here." Over the years, psychology in Seattle became more than content. It became a refuge. For the anxious. The curious. The traumatized. And yes, even the broken. Not to be fixed, but to be understood. Pause. Then softly. And isn't that what we all want? Not solutions. Not perfection. Just to be understood. Dr. Honda didn't just teach therapy. He modeled it. He showed us what it looked like to be present. Even when it was hard. Even when it cost him. And for that, his legacy isn't just episodes. Or followers. Or views. His legacy is the people who now speak a little softer. Listen a little deeper. Judge a little less. Maybe it started as a podcast. But what it became was a quiet revolution. A rebellion against cynicism. A reminder that kindness is not weakness. That boundaries are not rejection. And that healing, real healing, is messy, imperfect, and always, always worth it. So whether you listened in your darkest hour, or stumbled in out of curiosity, you were part of it. A movement without a name. A therapy session without a couch. A reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing is simply one human listening to another. Was the story of psychology in Seattle, and the man who dared to feel everything.